Hello, my name is Dr. Dennis Raverty, and I'm going to speak to you today about postmodern theory in the visual arts. Postmodernism, the term, was first coined in the contemporary world by architectural historian and theorist Charles Jencks in 1978. A year later, Jean-François Lyotard, a French philosopher, published La Condition Postmoderne, which means the postmodern condition, a report on epistemology, or a report on the state of knowledge is another way to interpret that. There are four basic ideas that are the key to postmodern theory in the visual arts. The first is that the mute, abstract objecthood of late modernist discourse, especially in the discourse of formalism as articulated by Clement Greenberg in the 1950s and 60s, is largely represented by representation as an important concept. Representation here is not meant in the narrow sense of realistic rendering, but representation by a series of signs, of reality, that we look at reality mediated through representations. 2. Representation is understood as a complex of signs of various sorts, both images, texts, tastes, symptoms. A complex of signs through which a society sees itself. 3. Images and texts, some of them, have become so ingrained in our thinking that they are accepted without question by us. They become the underlying assumptions in all our dealings with the world. These are sometimes called meta-narratives. 4. Postmodernism or post-structuralism and its theories questions these underlying assumptions or meta-discourses and attempts to deconstruct representations as if they are texts. Once again, 1. Abstract objecthood is replaced by representation. 2. Representation is understood as a complex of signs through which a society sees itself. 3. These representations have become so deeply ingrained that they are accepted without question by us. And 4th, postmodernist theory questions these underlying assumptions and attempts to deconstruct representations as if they were texts. To give you a little history of the movement, as we said, Charles Jencks first talked about postmodernism in 1978 in reference to architecture. And he noted double encoding as a symptom of postmodern architecture and thought, and he also talked about eclecticism of styles, mixing styles together in an eclectic manner, as opposed to the formalist, pure modernism of modernist architecture as it was practiced from the 1920s to the 1970s. In 1975, Art Forum, national, very important magazine of the contemporary arts, the editor, Rosalind Krauss, resigned. In spring of 1976, Krauss founded October magazine, published in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the major writers associated with October were Craig Owens, Hal Foster, and Benjamin Buchloh, in addition to Rosalind Krauss. It was published through MIT Press and continues to be published and continues to be on the forefront of postmodernist theoretical discourse. Also teaching at the time at MIT was Noam Chomsky, Dr. Noam Chomsky, a linguist and political commentator, a radical political commentator, and he was an inspiration to those people. An even more important influence on these art theorists were a series of French philosophers. François Lyotard, who I had mentioned earlier, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean Baudrillard. First, let's look at the genesis of postmodern thought, which goes all the way back to the beginning of the century and comes out of the field of linguistics, particularly that branch of linguistics that studies meaning in language, how we arrive at meaning in language. And this subfield of linguistics is called semiotics, the study of meaning in language. And the real granddaddy of semiotic theory is Ferdinand de Saussure, a French linguist who, although he never really wrote down his theories, had extensive notebooks and was a very celebrated lecturer. And from his notes, his students published his work posthumously, and it's been enormously important in subsequent theory from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the new millennium. And Saussure says, quote, "Language is a system of signs that expresses ideas, and it is therefore comparable to a system of writing, the alphabet of deaf mutes, symbolic rites, polite formulas, military signals, and etc., etc. A science that studies the life of signs within society is conceivable. It would be a part of social psychology and consequently of general psychology. I shall call it semiology. Semiology would show what constitutes signs, what laws govern them. Since the science does not yet exist, no one can say what it would be, but it has the right to exist, a place staked out in advance. Linguistics is only a part of the general science of semiology. The laws discovered by semiology will be applicable to linguistics, and the latter will circumscribe a well-defined area within the mass of anthropological and sociological facts." Semiotics has indeed spread well beyond linguistics, first to the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and anthropology, just as Saussure had predicted way back in 1913. But let us begin with the language theory of semiotics and then broaden our discussion out into its eventual entry into the social sciences, and from thence into philosophy and art and aesthetic theory. First of all, as Saussure says, semiotics is the study of signs. The observation has been made that all languages, even those that are not at all related to one another, are similar in structure. They all have nouns, they all have verbs, they all have prepositional phrases, they all have predicates, they all have sentences, they all have a kind of common structure. Now, of course, this would not be unusual if we compare, for example, German and English or French and English, because these languages are directly related. However, the surprising thing is Chinese and English, or Swahili and Korean are similar structurally. And this has led to the feeling that the structure of language is innate, is given, is not learned, but is part of the way the brain functions and part of the way that we tend to give meaning universally to our world, to our universe. Languages are made, as Saussure said, language is a system of signs. And a sign is made up of two parts, a signifier and a signified. For example, when we look at a chair, there is the actual object, and then there is the signifier for a chair, which is the word chair. Another signifier of the chair could be a drawing of the chair. Another signifier of the chair could be, of course, a photograph of the chair, or merely pointing to the chair is also a signifier of the chair. So we can see that this object, this utilitarian object, has a number of different ways of being signified in communication. Now, the combination of the signifier and a signified, the chair and the signifier, whatever it be, photograph, drawing, indexical pointing, word chair, is arbitrary. There's no reason that we should have to call this object a chair. And in fact, in different languages, it's called different things. In French, it's called chaise. In German, it's Stuhl. There's nothing innately connected between Stuhl and this object or chair and this object. We could just as well call it a teetotum. The relationship between a signifier and the signified is usually arbitrary. The signifiers differ in different languages or systems of signification. For example, the color black in most Western societies signifies death, and a whole number of other associated emotions and feelings, death. We call Black Tuesday the name of the day that the stock market crashed in 1929. We say it was a black day for Napoleon when he met his end at Waterloo. Black signifies death, signifies the end, and we wear black clothing at a funeral. However, in Japan, black is worn at weddings. It does not have the same significance in the Japanese system of signs. Therefore, a bride may wear black at her wedding, and that would be totally appropriate. If a bride wore black at her wedding in a Western society, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in America, it would be highly unusual. You would have a hard time even finding, you'd have to have the dress specially made, and people would feel very uncomfortable because it's a signal not of joy in birth, but of death. On the other hand, in Japanese society, white does signify death, and one wears white at funerals. However, one would not wear a white suit to a funeral in America or in France, because this is not the appropriate sign. However, the relationship between the idea of death and the color black is arbitrary. It could be any color at all, including its opposite, white. There are some signs which are not arbitrary, although most of them are. Different types of signs include, and this came into the field by an American pragmatist and linguist, Charles Sanders Peirce, also in the first couple decades of our century. He said besides totally arbitrary signs, like the word chair for the thing that we sit in, the word black, which would signify death, there are signs that are directly and not arbitrarily linked to the signifier. For example, footprints in the snow are a definite indication that someone has walked through the snow. This we call an indexical sign. Other indexical signs are, like I said, pointing at a chair, pointing at my head, right? This would be an indexical sign. In fact, we call this finger the index finger because of that very reason. Other indexical signs would be smoke, indexical sign of fire. You do not have smoke with water, you have smoke only when there's a fire. And the presence of smoke is a certain indicator of fire. Other types of indexical signs include symptoms. When one sneezes, this is an indexical signifier of a flu or cold virus in the body of the symptomatic person. These are all indexical signs, and indexical signs are not related arbitrarily, but directly to the signifier. Another type of sign that Charles Sanders Peirce found, or discovered, or described, are iconic signs. Iconic signs are representations that have some relationship, although not a direct indexical relationship, to the signifier. Such iconic signs are, for example, a drawing of someone or a drawing of some object. Also, all schematic diagrams, maps, seating charts, musical notation, where the notes go up on the staff when the pitch goes up, and they go down on the staff when the pitch goes down. Although there is a certain arbitrary nature to musical notes, And we can, the way that music is notated in China, for example, is different than it is in our modern Western system, as it is between, for example, medieval tablature, which is used for Gregorian chant, for example, in Catholic church services. It differs. However, they're all indexical in the sense that when the pitch goes up, the note goes up, or the neum goes up, or the signifier of it goes up. I've even seen Byzantine chant of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is in terms of sort of squiggles and lines. But again, when the pitch goes up, the squiggle goes up. And I don't know how to read Byzantine chant, and I apologize to any Orthodox Christians for calling them squiggles. I'm sure they have a more technical and appropriate name for this beautiful work. Indexical and iconic signs have a direct correspondence to the signifier, and therefore they're not entirely arbitrary. A fourth kind of sign, which is arbitrary, but is a specific kind of signifier that Peirce mentions, is the symbolic sign. That is, a lamb represents innocence. A lily represents virginity. A cross in our Western culture represents self-sacrifice or Christianity. These sort of symbolic signs are arbitrary. We could represent innocence with a cat, if that were appropriate. So there is an arbitrary nature to it, certainly. However, they have been conventionalized into symbols, and they can be read by anyone familiar with the discourse or the system of symbolic signs. So again, the four types of signifiers that Charles Sanders Peirce identified are totally arbitrary signs, indexical signs, iconic signs, and symbolic signs. Well, as we said, a sign is the combination of the signifier and the signified. Most often, the relationship is arbitrary between these things. But the thing that really gives them meaning is that they are a system of signs. Only within a systemic relationship do signs have any meaning. The word chair has meaning only because we put it into a sentence in I sit on the chair, for example, right? I sit down at the table on the chair. This gives it a context of other signs, therefore it has a meaning only within a system of signs. The word chair has no meaning within the system of signs that make up the German language. And if you said, ich sitze auf dem Chair, German would not know what you're talking about, because a chair is not part of the system of signs of the German language. So all signs, whether they are military signals, dance steps, ritual of any sort, etiquette, only makes sense within that system of signs. One of the interesting cross-cultural things we see is that in Chinese culture, for example, one puts rice in a bowl and holds the bowl up and eats it like this. Now, in Western society, to pick up the bowl is something children do. They pick up the bowl and they eat their soup, or a boor would do, or someone that doesn't understand the system of etiquette of signs. Therefore, Western people, when they eat Chinese food, tend to put rice down on the plate and then pour whatever it is, food, mugu gai pan, or whatever it is, on top of the rice and eat it with a fork. However, in China, this is not the way it's done, and that would be seen as impolite in their society, however, picking up a bowl. So these are signs. This etiquette of table manners, for example, would be a sign. In India, one eats always with his hands, never with chopsticks, never with knives and forks, and one only eats with the right hand, never with the left hand. It would be considered very boorish indeed to use the left hand to eat with, as it would be considered boorish in high Indian culture at a grand feast to use a fork or to use chopsticks. These are signs of outsiders, of people who don't understand the system of etiquette of eating within Indian civilized society. All right? Eating, we have a lot of rituals around eating. We can see, however, my basic point is this is a system. Perhaps the easiest way to understand system of signification are games, because games have very organized rules. Let's take, for example, cards. Playing cards, the relationship, structural relationship in cards is the only important thing. The individual images that are linked to those cards are arbitrary. For example, one could play poker with a deck of cards that instead of having a king, a queen, and a jack, would have instead an emperor, an empress, and a knight. This would not change any of the games that we play, even with these different things. Or we could even have Larry, Moe, and Curly, the Three Stooges, and in fact that would be kind of an interesting deck of cards. The Surrealists were, in the 1930s, kind of made a habit of designing weird, strange decks of cards. And they could play any of the normal games with these cards, or even read them like a fortune teller, because it was the structure of having three high cards, an ace, and digited cards from 2 to 10. They can be anything. They can be cups, they can be hearts, they can be diamonds, they can be spades, they can be kitties, they can be anything, shamrocks, anything you'd want to have. And one could still play the games as long as the arbitrary signifiers were in place. However, you can imagine that if you changed the structure, it would not work. If we had 8 queens instead of 4, it would change the values of the whole deck, and all games would be affected. Imagine it would be much easier to have 4 of a kind, a very, very high hand. In poker, for a game that's well known perhaps to many people, it'd be very simple to have 4 queens if there were 8 or 16 queens. So we can see that the system of cards and all the games that have very circumcised rules within the card deck, the relationship between those cards are structured according to a system, and it's the structure that is important, not the individual faces on the cards or the types of symbolic representations that we put on the cards. It's a system of representation. Likewise, for those of you who play chess, it makes no difference whatsoever if the chess pieces are in wood or ivory or plastic. One could even change them completely so that the queen became the charwoman and the knight became the dog. As long as they had the same relationship and were on the same sort of board, they would be, one could play chess in the very normal way that we do, and all the rules and everything would be exactly the same. The value of the pieces would be the same. However, if we changed to have 3 queens, or 4 rooks, or 16 pawns, the whole dimensions and dynamics of the game would change amazingly. Imagine, for example, if you had 2 kings in chess. You could checkmate 1 king, and the game would still not be over because there'd be another king, a spare king. So you can see that the pieces. Also the board, or the field of discourse, the circumscribed entity of the board in chess is 8 squares by 8 squares. It doesn't matter if those squares are black and white, if they're ivory and wood, if they're red and pink, as long as it's an 8 by 8 system that's circumscribed in that way. However, you can imagine if it were 2 by 16, a long sort of game, it would change everything. Imagine the movements of the diagonally moving bishop, who instead of being able to go across the whole board, would only be able to go 1 space at a time. So you see his value would be very much diminished in a chessboard that was anything but 8 by 8. So again, we can see here, it's the structure that relates the signs together that gives them their value and allows you to play the game by the same rules. Games are easy, discrete fields or systems to talk about, and that's why we begin with that. However, systems operate as discrete fields, just like a game board, within systems of signification. In critical theory, we call these fields of discourse, fields of discourse. So we could speak about the discourse of table etiquette in China or in America, right? You don't pick up a cheeseburger with chopsticks. It's not part of the system. Meanings only operate within their own field of discourse. For example, if you're playing poker and you say, aha, checkmate, doesn't mean anything. It's outside of the field of discourse in poker. Likewise, if you're playing chess and you said, gin, and you laid down the king or a piece, it wouldn't mean anything because it only has meaning within a card game of gin. Games, as I said, are a good example because their meaning is inscribed with clear rules, as are the parameters of the field of discourse. Now, the same is true with systems of belief. For example, let's take a familiar discourse like Christianity. In this discourse, some terms of the discourse, if we can talk about it as if it's a text, even though Christianity is not a text, it's a system of belief, there are some terms, we call them, or sites within this conceptual net, within this network of signs, that are more important than others. For example, original sin is key to the concept of Christianity, that man is sinful by nature because Adam ate the apple off the tree. Without original sin, the meaning, the significance of the death of Jesus on the cross loses its meaning because he comes to deliver mankind or redeem mankind from original sin. So I'm not up here giving you preaching to you about Christian theology. I only use it because it's a very well-known system of belief. And of course it is a system. A religion is a system. As I said, original sin and redemption from original sin are very deep structures, terms embedded very deep in the discourse. And as we said at the very beginning of this lecture, some terms of a discourse are very deeply inscribed in the text. They're so deeply inscribed, sometimes we're not aware of it. So if you were asked what is the most important idea in Christianity, you might not come up right away with original sin, although it's very, very deeply embedded. For example, in Judaism, there is no concept of original sin. And so the system of Judaism, although it shares the story of Adam and Eve and Exodus from Egypt and lots of other things, can't accept the Christian idea of Jesus because they don't believe in original sin. And so that's a very key structure within the discourse of the system of belief of Christianity. However, a less important tenet of Christianity, perhaps, to most Christians, I think, would be fair to say, is the virginity of Mary after the birth of Jesus. Christians generally believe that Mary was a virgin when Jesus was born, but only Catholics believe, I think this is right, only Catholics believe that she was a virgin, continued to be a virgin even after the birth of Jesus. However, some Protestant denominations believe that she did have other children by her husband Joseph, and these were the brothers of Jesus. And there's actually a tradition in some denominations of the brothers of Jesus. James the Just, I believe, was said to be the brother, or I suppose technically the half-brother of Jesus. The idea of the virginity of Mary after the birth of Jesus, although an important theological concept within the system of belief of Christianity, is not as deep a structure as original sin and redemption through the death of Jesus. It's just more peripheral. These deeper beliefs, these deeper terms of the discourse, if we can use post-structuralist terminology, these deep things are sometimes called meta-narratives or transcendental signifieds. They are so deeply ingrained in the discourse, whatever it may be, that we take them for granted. In the discourse of democracy, in which the American Republic was founded, a deeply ingrained idea is the possibility of the freedom of mankind. First interpreted to be literally the freedom of man. It didn't apply to slaves, it didn't apply to women. It's now been broadened out with the emancipation of the slaves and later with the granting of the vote to women. to also include humankind in general. This belief is what we would call a meta-discourse, running through the system of democratic government in which we believe. Like in architectural structures, the structures of belief systems, or discourses, or fields of discourse, as we say in postmodern theory, some of the structures are deeper and some are more peripheral. In architecture, for example, if we look at a Gothic cathedral, we can see the massive piers and the flying buttresses are much more important structural elements than, for example, the rose windows or the curtain walls. The windows can be smashed in a cathedral and the cathedral will not fall down. However, remove one stone from one of the giant piers and the entire structure will be demolished. Likewise, in all fields of discourse, the structure of them, some of the structures are very deep, and these are called meta-discourses. These are called meta-narratives within a discourse, or transcendental signifieds by Derrida. Also, codes are inscribed for proper behavior. Just to give another example, I'm here lecturing to you today on the television set, and I'm dressed like a art history professor with a tie and so forth. If I were to be lecturing here on this television screen nude, it would be very inappropriate. And in fact, I might actually lose my job or be arrested for indecent exposure. However, if I were nude down in the drawing studio where we have nude models all the time, this would not be inappropriate at all. So the very same signifier, that is nudity, is appropriate in one field of discourse or one setting or context or situation, and it would be highly inappropriate in another situation. I'm sure you can think of many of these sorts of things in the various codes and systems of belief. Now, deeply ingrained structures, which Derrida calls privileged signifiers, are related to values, what we value, what we believe is true. That's why people are very, very dedicated to their systems of belief. People hold very dearly, people that believe in a democratic society hold very dearly the meta-narrative of the freedom of and the equality of all human beings. This makes it a system like Nazism, a system like Stalinist communism, with different values, very upsetting to our whole concept of democracy, because deeply ingrained is this concept of freedom in the discourse. So we can see here that deep structures, meta-narratives, are related to values. They are also related to power. There are also power positions within any given structure. So power and value are two of the things that we look for when we are analyzing fields of discourse. Now, these ideas from semiotics, the study of language and sign systems in general, were expanded to include the social sciences, beginning in the 1950s with anthropology. We see that human behavior has conventions, each particular to its culture or subculture. Things are forbidden or allowed. For example, let's look at something very obvious. Incest taboos are against siblings. It's very deeply ingrained that we're not going to marry our sister. However, this is not universal. For example, in ancient Egypt, the pharaohs were expected to marry their sisters and normally did, and normally had no problem with this. We're not repulsed by this. It reflected their system of values. Although to us, it's almost unthinkable because these are such deeply ingrained values within our anthropological system. Of course, we understand that when we go from culture to culture, each one is a different system of signs. Therefore, what might be appropriate behavior in one culture is not appropriate behavior in another culture. For example, in Italian society, men touch each other, men kiss each other, heterosexual men. And this is not considered unusual or abnormal. However, when an American or a German goes to Italy, they tend to feel men feel very, very uncomfortable. I know I did when I first went to Italy, with the closeness, with the touching that goes on between men. However, you kind of adapt to the new system, and eventually it seems normal, and then when you come back, it seems odd. So you see, these are all systems of signs that have different meanings. If men kiss in American society, it's a sign that they're homosexuals. In Italian society, it doesn't have the same significance. It's a different meaning because there's a different system of meaning of distance, touch, kissing, affection, have different meanings within these two societies. In psychology, and a number of what's called the cognitive revolution, in cognitive psychology, it's considered that the psyche or the human mind operates as a sort of cognitive map or a net that we throw over reality, and it helps us interpret our environment and everything else. There are some deeply ingrained psychological things that some of them are very good and some of them are very bad. Or not bad, but some of them are really dysfunctional. And this is the cause of mental illness. For example, if your father always said to you, "You'll never amount to anything," and you're told this over and over and over, it comes to be a deeply regarded belief within that conceptual or cognitive map that forms your psychology, and therefore it may lead to a continual failure. Under cognitive therapy by a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they would tend to want to unearth these deeply held irrational beliefs and make you see the irrationality of them, all right? There's also, of course, in psychology, the idea of abnormality and normality. And this differs from culture to culture, from person to person. For example, in the Middle Ages, Joan of Arc heard voices in the bells, voices of St. Michael, of St. Anne, that told her various different things, revelations about what she should do. Joan was considered a saint and was canonized by the church after her martyrdom. However, in our own society, if I were to hear voices in the bells or to see visions of angels, I would be termed a schizophrenic and would be put in a mental institution. Joan of Arc may have very well ended up there had she lived in our society because there were different cognitive maps that structured abnormality versus normality. Now, what is it? Again, there are deeper structures and more peripheral structures. The deeper structures in anthropology, in psychology, in our social life would be considered, are sometimes called privileged terms. Now, if we get to, and all these applications of linguistic theory of semiotics and meanings and systems of signs came to be applied to the social sciences, anthropology, psychology, and sociology in the 50s, 60s, and 70s already. Then, with the advent of the philosopher Jacques Derrida, we begin to have the concept of post-structuralism. And post-structuralism, or deconstruction as it's sometimes called, begins with an analysis of these structures that form part of the social sciences, of our social life, of our psychological life, and in the various systems of signification that we have in our society, in our world, in our private life. Post-structuralism begins to deconstruct these, and it was the idea of Derrida that whenever we have a privileged signifier within a system, there's also a marginal opposite signifier. For example, we know masculinity and femininity is a good example. Attributes of masculinity are considered in our traditional culture strength, virility, commandingness, intelligence, straightforwardness. The marginal terms are the opposite terms that would be considered feminine. Weakness, submissiveness, delicateness, all these kinds of dumbness even, right, would be considered feminine in a traditional thing. However, in the 1970s, the feminist movement began to deconstruct the codes of masculinity and femininity. Because remember, and this is key, that the relationship between a signifier and a signified is most often arbitrary. There's nothing arbitrary at all about maleness and femaleness. This is physical attributes. However, masculinity and femininity are culturally inscribed codes of behavior and norms, which vary from culture to culture. There are tribal peoples in New Guinea that the men wear makeup and they spend the day primping their hair. The women go out and do the work. However, the men are also fierce warriors in this society. So we can see that norms of behavior, like masculinity and femininity, for example, are arbitrary. And so feminists in the 70s began to question some of the marginalization of their status within our society, being stereotyped as dumb blondes, being stereotyped as weak or as ineffectual or as submissive, and began to assert a new sort of code to deconstruct and to question these deeply held values and beliefs. And of course, whenever you question deeply held beliefs within a system, you run into a lot of flack, because these are based on values, and people stand up for their values. So the feminist movement offended a lot of people's values and their sensibilities. Another type of deconstruction that was popular in the 70s as well is the deconstruction of race, racial stereotypes. For example, black liberation was based on reassignment, a deconstruction of the codes of race, which privileges Caucasians and marginalizes people of color. And so the term black is beautiful that came out of the discourse of the civil rights movement and the black liberation movement was an affirmation that black need not be synonymous with death, with emptiness, with lack of something, with shadiness, with evil, all the kind of connotations. Just think about it. Devil's food cake is black. Angel food cake is white, right? We have all sorts of signifiers like that. So marginalized minorities, like blacks, like gays, like women, began to assert in the 1970s, began to use the methods of deconstruction to deconstruct privileged and marginalized terms, often taking the marginalized terms and putting it in the center. These privileged terms, Jacques Derrida, as I said in his book, Toward a Critique of the Sign, these deep structures serve to limit the play of signification within a field of discourse. Really deeply embedded terms essential to the articulation of a given signifying system are often understood as existing independently of that system. They are so deeply ingrained we're not aware of them. Let's deconstruct the idea of the freedom of mankind, right? Freedom is opposed to slavery, the marginalized term. Liberation is opposed to oppression, the marginalized term. By rising up from slavery, demanding freedom and equality, we've deconstructed these codes, which are, after all, arbitrary. So there is something very liberating people have found with being able to see that social, psychological, political, economic systems are systems that are ultimately arbitrary. There is some, for example, debate within the feminist movement about whether certain attributes of femininity are actually arbitrary or are innate, are indexical, right? Some women believe there is an innate sort of femininity, which might not be dumbness, but might be, for example, willingness to listen, that might not be, or a will to domination in men, that might be related to the presence of the hormone testosterone in the male system that would affect in an indexical and ingrained and innate way masculinity and femininity. This is still a very important debate within the discourse of feminism and gender studies in general. Now in art, what this has meant is the deconstruction of the modernist paradigm, and the modernist paradigm privileged masculinity, privileged the so-called fine arts over the crafts or over popular art, privileged white art over minority art and expressions, and all these serious art over decorative art, and on and on and on. And since we began to understand postmodern theory as all these systems, for example, the system of modernism being simply an arbitrary system of signs, there's nothing that necessarily means that art should be pure. There's nothing that necessarily means that painting and sculpture are superior to weaving or pottery making. And so there's been, for example, a movement of the crafts to claim their centralized authority within the discourse of fine arts. For example, feminists have rediscovered the beauty of quilt making. Quilt making, a really beautiful craft form, was often considered women's work and therefore disparaged. It was also decorative rather than serious, and decorative arts were marginalized as compared to the so-called serious arts of, for example, bronze casting or metal sculpture. Representation had become marginalized by the discourse of modernism, which favored formal plastic values and purity, and postmodern art has tended to value representation and value context, something within a context of a system of signs rather than divorced, pure, and removed from everything in that sense. Particularly important within the postmodern discourse in the visual arts has tended to be the photograph. Because the photograph and film and video, as well as mediums, combine two important types of signifiers. That is, a photograph or a moving image like the one you're looking at right now combines iconic representation of my face and myself with also an indexical sign, because after all, the light that hits the film that's reflected from my face and my clothing forms an imprint like a footprint in the snow, and therefore a photograph or any images derived from photography, film, video, representations have a particularly important and powerful function within systems of representation, and that's why they've been so key. We've also been able to deconstruct the systems that occur in the art world, that there's nothing innate about the canon of historical masterpieces that we've seen. See how the privileged masculine term master is planted. They're not mistress pieces, but masterpieces, right? And show mastery and dominance and will and these sort of traditionally held to be masculine forms of expression. There's nothing to say that the canon or the received history of art is necessarily the correct history of art. History, after all, is also just a representation in the sign of systems. We can take a number of facts, we can put up a number of different works of art, and then we implot them by weaving a narrative through them. One could see, for example, the events of the French Revolution as being a wonderfully liberating experience, or from an old-fashioned aristocratic stance, could be seen as the outbreak of barbarism and an end to all civility that was part of the ancient regime, or the system of kings and queens and these others that had, they thought, divine right from God to rule over other people. So you see, the story of the Civil War would tend to be implotted very differently by a liberal Democrat from the North than by a Ku Klux Klan member from the South. Although they might use the exact same events, they would implot them differently because the values that they have would tend to see them weave the master narrative in a different way. We can likewise see that the master narrative of modern art, as it has been given to us, is not necessarily, it ain't necessarily so. And so our history becomes a very exciting field that I actually abandoned painting for art history because partly I realized that I had the right to and the ability and the license to rewrite history according to what I thought and then plot those narratives in different sorts of ways, and has led to the rediscovery of formerly marginalized groups, women's art through the ages, the contributions of African Americans, to name just two familiar examples. Once again then, in conclusion, this brief survey of postmodern theory has held four basic ideas to be the key ideas in all these things. Abstract objecthood was largely replaced by the idea of representation in postmodernism. Representation is understood not as realistic rendering or drawing, but as a complex of signs. We see and understand reality only as a mediated representation. We don't know what real reality is. We only know reality as viewed through our own system of our own psychological system and our own mediated reality. Images and text in these representations, some of them have become so deeply ingrained, they're accepted by us without question, like ideas of masculinity and femininity, like the idea of the liberation of mankind, for two prominent examples in our own fields of discourse. Postmodern theory, however, questions these underlying assumptions and attempts to deconstruct representations as if they're texts, therefore liberating our representations and allowing us to change our static ideas of what reality is. Reality is mediated. There is no real reality. There is only our mediated reality as seen by us, given our experiences, given the social, psychological, and other discursive fields of discourse and systems of understanding that we represent our world by. I hope that this tape has helped understand, and is just a beginning to understanding postmodern theory in the visual